The courtroom was packed and airless. Judge Evelyn Carter brought her gavel down hard and fixed her eyes on the man sitting in the wheelchair. Below her voice, flat her patience already gone. She told him to stand up. Right now. She said she wasn't going to sit there and watch a grown man hide behind a chair to win sympathy points in a property dispute. The man said nothing. He didn't move. Then, a few minutes later, the courtroom doors swung open, and an elderly woman took one look at him and burst into tears, calling his name, like she already knew exactly who he was. The courthouse on Mercer Street had seen thousands of cases walk through its doors: divorces, disputes, custody, fights, fraud claims. Most of them blurred together after a while. But the morning Ryan Holloway rolled through the front entrance, something about the air in the building felt different. Not dramatic, just heavy in a way that didn't lift. Ryan arrived early the way he always did when he needed to feel like he still had some control over something. His wheelchair was old, the kind that showed its age in the scuffed armrests and the slightly uneven left wheel that pulled just a little to the side. He wore a clean gray shirt and dark slacks, his hands resting loose in his lap. He didn't look like a man preparing for battle. He looked like a man who had already been through several and was simply too tired to pretend otherwise. He had worked as a construction engineer for nearly a decade, the kind of work that required him to be physically present to walk job sites, to climb scaffolding, to read the ground beneath his feet. After the accident, all of that ended. He had rebuilt himself slowly into remote design work, taking contracts online, drafting structural layouts from the small desk in his home office. It wasn't the same. It was never going to be the same, but it was enough to keep him inside a life he had some claim to, and the most important part of that life was the house on Callaway Drive that he had owned before Claire ever entered the picture. Claire arrived 20 minutes later with her attorney, a polished man in a navy suit who carried his briefcase like a prop. Claire herself was dressed in soft, gray, understated, carefully chosen. She had the look of someone who had practiced appearing reasonable for a long time. She didn't glance at Ryan when she walked past. That deliberate avoidance said more than any look would have. Judge Evelyn Carter entered the courtroom at exactly 9 in the morning. The room rose. She took her seat with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same motion 10,000 times and found it neither meaningful nor tedious, just necessary. She was sharp-featured mid-50s, with reading glasses she wore on a thin chain around her neck. Her reputation in the county was well established, thorough, fast, unsentimental. She did not take kindly to DeLay's theatrics, or what she privately categorized as emotional manipulation, dressed up as legal argument. She had known Claire socially for several years, through a mutual professional circle. It was not a close friendship, more the kind of familiarity that builds between people who attend the same events and share the same general worldview. Evelyn would not have described herself as biased. She would have said she simply had enough experience with people to read a room quickly. And the room, as she read it that morning, told her that the man in the wheelchair was the problem. She looked at Ryan the way someone looks at a minor inconvenience they have already decided how to handle. There was no malice in it, not yet. Just a quiet, practiced dismissal. Claire's attorney opened the case with a clean, well-rehearsed summary. The marriage had lasted 6 years. The couple had separated, following a serious accident that left Ryan with permanent spinal damage. Claire had continued to support the household financially during the early months of Ryan's recovery at considerable personal cost. Now she was seeking her rightful share of the marital assets, specifically the house on Callaway Drive, which had appreciated significantly in value and which Ryan was refusing to relinquish despite having no practical means of maintaining it independently. Everything about the presentation was technically accurate and strategically incomplete. Ryan's attorney, a younger man named Douglas, competent but notably less polished than opposing counsel, offered the counterposition. The house had been purchased by Ryan before the marriage. Claire's name had been added to the deed 3 years into the relationship, but the original down payment and the majority of the mortgage payments had come from Ryan's income alone. Claire had moved out within 4 months of the accident. Ryan was not refusing to cooperate. He was refusing to surrender the one asset that allowed him to live with any degree of independence. Claire sat with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral throughout Douglas's statement. She had the disciplined stillness of someone who had been coached to look like the calm party in the room. When it was her turn to speak directly, Claire addressed the judge with a quiet, measured tone that made everything she said sound like reluctant honesty. She said that she had not wanted things to come to this. She said Ryan had always been a proud man, and that after the accident, that pride had curdled into something harder to live with a refusal to acknowledge reality, a tendency to frame every practical conversation as a personal attack. She said she had tried. She said she still respected him. She said the house was simply too large and too expensive for one person in his situation to manage, and that letting him stay there was not compassion, it was enabling. Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. Evelyn made a note. Ryan did not respond to any of it. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at a fixed point on the wall just above the judge's bench. Not defiant, not broken. Just somewhere slightly outside the room in the way a person gets when they have learned to wait out things they cannot stop. Evelyn found his silence irritating. In her experience, silence in a courtroom was either the sign of someone with nothing useful to say or someone trying to appear above the proceedings. Neither reflected well. She watched him for a moment and decided he was doing both. Douglas submitted Ryan's financial documentation, mortgage records, property, history, insurance correspondence, and requested that the court take into account Ryan's primary use and long-term residency in the home. Evelyn reviewed the documents quickly, asked two sharp questions about the timeline of Claire's name being added to the deed, and received answers that satisfied nothing. Then Claire's attorney did something that changed the temperature of the room. He stood and told the court that they had reason to believe Ryan's use of a wheelchair was not entirely consistent with his actual physical limitations. He chose his words carefully. He did not say Ryan was faking. He said there was a pattern of behavior that suggested Ryan was at minimum using his physical presentation to generate sympathy that was not medically warranted. He referenced the fact that no detailed independent medical assessment had been submitted to the court. He noted that Ryan's remote work output had actually increased in the months following the accident, which suggested a level of function that warranted examination. Claire kept her eyes forward. She did not look at Ryan. Evelyn leaned back slightly in her chair and looked at Ryan directly for the first time since the proceedings began. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted a decision being made quietly and with full confidence. She asked Ryan to stand. The request landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Several people in the gallery went still. Douglas started to rise from his seat, already forming an objection. But Evelyn held up one hand without looking at him and kept her eyes on Ryan. Ryan looked at her, not with anger, not with shock, with the expression of a man who had been asked something he had known was coming eventually and had simply hoped wouldn't arrive today. He said he would not stand. The room got very quiet. Evelyn set down her pen. She told him plainly that this was her courtroom, that she had asked a straightforward question, and that refusing to cooperate with the court was not a neutral act. She said she wasn't asking him to perform. She was asking him to clarify his physical condition so that the court could assess the claims being made on both sides with accurate information. She said it one more time, "Stand up, Mr. Holloway." Ryan looked at her without moving. He said he understood what she was asking. He said he was not going to do it. And then before she could respond, he said something she had not expected. He said he had a witness he wanted to call. Someone who could speak to the circumstances of his injury directly. Someone who had been there. Evelyn studied him for a long moment. The offer was irregular. The witness had not been listed in pre-trial submissions. Douglas had not flagged any additional testimony, and the request had the feel of a delay tactic. But there was something in the way Ryan said it that gave her a half-second of hesitation she couldn't entirely justify. Not desperation. Not strategy. something closer to a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time and had just decided to set it down. She told him she would allow it. The witness would be contacted and brought in. Court would recess for 40 minutes. Claire leaned toward her attorney and said something low and quick. He nodded once and wrote something on his legal pad. Ryan said nothing else. He turned his wheelchair toward the side wall and waited. The recess stretched into something that felt longer than 40 minutes, even when it wasn't. The gallery didn't fully clear. People stepped out into the hallway, got coffee from the vending machine. Down the corridor, came back to their seats, with the restless energy of people waiting to see whether something interesting was going to happen or not. Claire used the time well. She moved through the gallery, slowly speaking to a few people she knew. She had a gift for making a room feel like it was already on her side, before anyone had said anything official. By the time the recess ended, the mood had settled into a low, skeptical hum that was pointed mostly in Ryan's direction. When Evelyn returned to the bench and the room resettled, she looked at Douglas and asked whether the witness was on their way. Douglas said yes. He said he had made the call during the recess, and the witness had confirmed they would come. Evelyn acknowledged that with a short nod and moved to fill the waiting time with procedural review of the financial documentation. Claire's attorney used the opportunity to submit 3 additional exhibits, a series of text message exchanges, a set of bank statements, and a printed summary of what he described as Ryan's communication history in the months surrounding the separation. He characterized them as evidence of Ryan's pattern of financial non-cooperation. Evelyn reviewed each one without visible reaction. Ryan watched the documents being handed across the room from the corner of his eye. He had seen them before. He had known they would show up eventually. The messages were real, stripped of every piece of context that made them mean something different than what they appeared to mean on the surface. That was the thing about paper. It had no memory of tone, no record of what had been said 10 minutes before or after. It just sat there, flat and permanent, saying the thing it said. He thought about the night of the accident. He didn't let himself think about it often. The rain on the pavement. The sound from across the street, sharp, cut off fast. The split-second calculation that wasn't really a calculation at all, just a direction his body moved before his mind caught up. The headlights, the impact, and then the ground, and then nothing for a long time. He had never told Claire what actually happened that night. By the time he was conscious enough to explain, she had already built her own version of events, that he had been careless, that he had been somewhere he shouldn't have been, that the accident was the final proof of a recklessness she had been tolerating for years. He had not corrected her. He had been too depleted to fight for the narrative, and later, when he had the strength, it had stopped seeming worth it. Now, it was worth it. Not for himself exactly, but because the person he had never named, never involved, never burdened with the weight of what had happened, that person was the only one who could walk into this room and tell the truth in a way that no document could contest. He just hoped she would actually come. The courtroom doors were at the far end of the room behind the gallery seating. Ryan couldn't see them from where he sat without turning fully around, and he didn't turn. He kept his eyes forward on the bench, on the slow, procedural machinery grinding through its motions. Claire's attorney was speaking again, something about property valuation. Evelyn was asking a follow-up question. Douglas was flipping through a folder. And then the doors opened. Ryan heard them before he saw anything, the soft hydraulic push of the hinges, the sound of careful footsteps, and then a voice from somewhere in the gallery that made a sound not quite like a word, more like the release of something that had been held in for a long time. Ryan turned. An elderly woman stood just inside the doorway, supported by a courthouse aide. She was small, smaller than he remembered, and she moved slowly, but her eyes were clear and fixed entirely on him. She looked at him the way you look at someone you thought about every day for years, without being able to do anything about it. Her name was Margaret Carter. She took one more step into the room, and then she brought one hand to her mouth, and she cried. Not loudly. Not the way people cry when they want to be seen crying. Just the quiet, unmanageable kind that happens when a person has been carrying something heavy for too long and suddenly puts it down. She said his name. The room went completely still. Evelyn Carter, sitting behind the bench with her pen in her hand, looked at the woman in the doorway. And for the first time that morning, possibly for the first time in a very long while, the expression on her face was not certainty. It was recognition, followed immediately by something she had not been prepared for: confusion, and then a cold, creeping dread that she could not yet name. Because the woman standing in the doorway crying the name of the man she had just publicly humiliated was her mother. No one in the courtroom moved right away. They were all waiting to see if what just happened was actually what it looked like, if the woman in the doorway was who she appeared to be, if the connection between her and the judge was what everyone was already quietly calculating. The courthouse aide steadied Margaret by the elbow and guided her slowly down the center aisle. She kept her eyes on Ryan the entire way. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to make an entrance. She simply could not look anywhere else. Evelyn had not moved either. She sat with her pen still in her hand, and her face arranged into something neutral, the way a person holds their expression when they know every set of eyes in the room is on them, and they need a moment to process something privately before the world sees them react. The confusion was still there, visible at the edges in the slight tension around her mouth, in the way her eyes tracked her mother's slow progress down the aisle, and then moved back to Ryan, and then back to her mother again, as if she was still trying to find the mistake in what she was seeing. There was no mistake. Margaret reached the front of the gallery, and the aide helped her into a seat just behind the barrier. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Ryan with the steady, worn expression of someone who had been living with a specific weight for years and had finally been given permission to set it down. Ryan looked back at her. His face did not change dramatically, but something in his shoulders released almost imperceptibly, the way a door gives when the latch finally catches. Evelyn called the room back to order. Her voice came out level. Whatever she was feeling, she had decided it would stay behind the bench with her. Douglas stood and formally requested that the witness be recognized. Evelyn acknowledged Margaret Carter as a witness for the respondent, noted that her late submission to the proceedings was irregular, and made clear that the court would hear her testimony under the same standards applied to all other evidence. Then she told Margaret she could speak. Margaret did not need to be asked twice. She had been waiting for this longer than anyone in the room knew. She told the court that several years ago it had been a Tuesday night in late November, the kind of cold that came in sharp off the river. She had been walking back from a neighbor's apartment when a man came at her from behind a parked car. He grabbed her bag. When she pulled back, he shoved her hard into the street. She fell. He came after her. She was in the middle of the road when she saw the headlights of a truck coming around the bend, and she could not get up fast enough on her own. Ryan had been walking on the opposite side of the street. He saw it happen, crossed at a run, and pulled her out of the direct path of the truck. The truck clipped him as it braked. He took the impact on his lower back and left side and went down hard on the pavement. The attacker ran. Margaret was shaken, but physically intact. Ryan was not. She said that by the time the ambulance arrived, Ryan had told the paramedics she was a bystander who had witnessed the accident. He gave them her name and told them to make sure she got home safely. He did not identify her as the person he had pulled from the street. She didn't understand why until later, when she tried to contact him at the hospital, and a nurse relayed a message from him. He didn't want her to feel responsible. He didn't want her carrying that. Margaret's voice stayed even through most of it. It broke only once briefly on the word responsible, and then she steadied herself and kept going. She said she had respected his wish for a long time. She had not spoken publicly about what happened. She had not reached out again after his initial message. But she had thought about him every single day since. And when she received the call that morning, telling her that Ryan Holloway was in a courtroom being asked to prove his injury was real, she said she got up and put her coat on before the call was finished. The courtroom was completely quiet when she stopped talking. Evelyn looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she looked at Ryan. Then she set her pen down on the bench with a careful, deliberate motion and looked at neither of them for several seconds. Claire's attorney broke the silence first. He stood and said in a tone calibrated to sound respectful, while undermining everything that had just been said, that he appreciated the witness's account, and had no doubt she believed it fully. He said, however, that the events she described, while clearly significant to her personally, had no direct bearing on the property dispute before the court. The question of what happened to Ryan Holloway on a street several years ago did not change the legal status of the marital assets. He said this without looking at Ryan, keeping his attention focused on the judge. Evelyn did not respond to him immediately. She was still working through something behind her eyes. Claire, who had maintained her composed expression through Margaret's entire testimony, leaned slightly toward her attorney and said something quiet. He nodded. Then he stood again and told the court that his client had additional evidence to submit, financial records that had not been previously introduced, which spoke directly to Ryan's conduct during the separation period and his management of the couple's shared accounts. Evelyn told him to proceed. What came next was not new information to Ryan. He had known this moment was likely coming. He had just hoped that Margaret's testimony might make it irrelevant before it arrived. It did not. Claire's attorney laid out document by document a sequence of financial transactions from the period between Ryan's accident and the formal filing of the divorce. He showed that during Ryan's hospitalization and early recovery, Claire had liquidated several joint investment accounts and moved the proceeds into a personal account held in her name alone. He framed this not as concealment, but as financial protection. Claire acting responsibly to secure her own stability during a period of profound uncertainty in the marriage. Then he turned to the second part. He presented a set of written communications emails, primarily in which Claire had told several mutual acquaintances and one former colleague of Ryan's that Ryan was experiencing serious psychological instability following the accident. The emails described erratic behavior, mood episodes, and inability to function. He submitted these not as evidence of wrongdoing, but as context. He said background that explained why Claire had taken protective measures during the separation and why she genuinely believed Ryan's current legal position was motivated more by obstruction than genuine need. Ryan read the documents as they were passed across the room. His expression did not change, but his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair tightened just slightly and stayed that way. He had known about the account liquidations. He had discovered them about 6 months after the separation, when he was well enough to start sorting through the financial wreckage of the marriage. He had not known about the emails. He had not known that while he was lying in a hospital bed, relearning how to sit upright, Claire had been quietly constructing an alternate version of him for people they both knew, a version that was unstable, unreliable, diminished, a version that would be easy to leave and easier to explain. Something in the room shifted when that registered on his face. Not dramatic. Ryan was not a man who gave much away visibly, but the people watching closely enough could see that this had landed differently than anything else that morning. Not because it was worse than losing the use of his legs, but because it was a different kind of damage entirely. The accident had taken something from his body. This had been taken from his name while he wasn't looking, by someone who had stood beside him and made promises in front of people they both loved. Douglas objected to the characterization of the emails as contextual evidence and argued they represented a deliberate campaign to prejudice perception of his client in both social and legal contexts. Evelyn sustained the objection partially. She would not allow the emails to be read aloud into the record, but she did not exclude the documents themselves. Claire sat very still through all of it. She had the look of someone waiting for a storm to pass, certain it would. Evelyn looked at Ryan directly. She told him that the court had now heard testimony from the witness he had called and reviewed the financial evidence submitted by opposing counsel, and she needed to understand what response, if any, he intended to make to the claims about the accounts. Ryan looked at the judge without any expression she could easily read. He said that he hadn't touched the accounts after Claire moved out. He said he hadn't hired anyone to dispute the liquidations, because by the time he found out they were gone, the money was already spent. He said he wasn't there to talk about the accounts. He said he was there because the house on Calloway Drive was his, had been his, and was the only reason he was still able to live the way he was living, with some degree of independence, with access to the layout and the space he had modified at his own expense to accommodate his chair in a place that was structurally his before Claire ever signed anything. He said it plainly, not with heat, not as a speech, just as information offered to the room without decoration. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment after he finished. Something in her face was working through something. Not sympathy exactly. It was too early for that, and she was not a person who moved quickly toward feelings that required her to revise her prior position. But the certainty that had been there all morning was no longer entirely solid. A crack had appeared, small, but real, and she was aware of it. Claire's attorney, reading the room correctly, decided to press harder before the momentum shifted further. He stood without being recognized and told the court that his client had one final point to address a matter she had been reluctant to raise, but felt the proceedings now required her to speak to directly. Evelyn told him to sit down and wait to be recognized. He sat. Claire, however, stood. It was a small breach of procedure, and Evelyn moved to correct it, but Claire spoke before she could. She said she was sorry to interrupt the process. She said she understood the rules. She said she just needed 1 minute because she thought the court deserved to hear the truth from her directly, not filtered through her attorney. Her voice was measured, slightly trembling, in a way that read as controlled distress rather than actual loss of composure. She said that she had loved Ryan. She said that was never the question. She said she had stayed through the early months of his recovery because she believed in the man she had married and wanted to support him through something devastating. But she said that over time, the person she was living with had become someone she didn't recognize, someone who refused help, refused to engage with treatment, refused to acknowledge how the accident had changed not just his body, but his relationship to everything around him. She said leaving had been the hardest decision of her life. And she said that Ryan taking legal action to prevent her from accessing what she was legally entitled to was not, as his attorney had framed it, a matter of survival. It was a matter of control. It was the last thing left that he could hold over her. Nobody spoke when she finished. Ryan had listened to all of it without reacting. Now he looked at his hands in his lap for a moment. Then he looked up, not at Claire, not at her attorney, but at Evelyn, and he said quietly and without inflection that he didn't have anything left to add. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not a reversal, just a man reaching the end of what he was able to carry in a single day and putting it down without ceremony in front of everyone, because there was nothing left to pretend he wasn't exhausted. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at her mother, who was still seated in the gallery, watching Ryan with an expression that was entirely clear. Then she looked down at the bench in front of her, at the documents, and the notes, and the pen she had set down earlier. She told the court she was calling a brief recess before proceeding to deliberation. Her voice was even. Her face was controlled. But the crack that had appeared earlier was wider now, and she was no longer sure the wall was going to hold. She stood, and the room rose with her, and she walked through the door behind the bench without looking at anyone. The moment the door closed behind her, the sound of the courtroom, the shuffling, the low voices, the exhale of a room released from formal attention, rose back up to fill the space she had left behind. But something had changed in the temperature of it. The current was running differently now, and most of the people in that room could feel it, even if they couldn't have said exactly why. Ryan sat where he was and did not move. He was not waiting for anything in particular. He was simply still the way a person gets when they have given everything they had, and there is nothing left to do but let the room decide what to do with it. The room behind the bench was small and deliberately plain. A desk, 2 chairs, a narrow window that looked out onto the courthouse parking lot. Evelyn stood at that window for a long time without sitting down. She had handled hundreds of recesses in rooms exactly like this one. She had used them to review notes, to consult case law, to compose the precise language of a ruling before returning to deliver it. She had never once used one to stand at a window and try to understand how badly she had misread a room. She thought about the moment Margaret had walked through those doors, the sound of her mother's voice saying a stranger's name with that particular kind of grief, the kind that only comes from carrying something alone for too long. Evelyn had heard her mother cry before. She knew the sound of it. What she had heard in that courtroom was different. It was relief, and the fact that Ryan Holloway's presence was what had produced that relief in her mother, a man Evelyn had spent the entire morning treating as a nuisance and a manipulator, sat in her chest like something she could not swallow down. She was not someone who revisited her decisions easily. That was not humility or stubbornness. It was simply how she was built. She moved forward. She assessed, she ruled, she moved on. It was what made her effective, and what had, over the years, occasionally made her wrong in ways she didn't discover until much later, if at all. This time, she had discovered it in real time in front of a full gallery, and the discovery had not been gentle. She sat down at the desk and opened the financial file that Douglas had submitted at the start of the proceedings, the one she had reviewed quickly that morning, and set aside in favor of Claire's more polished presentation. She read it again, now slower. The original mortgage documents, the timeline of payments, the deed history, the insurance correspondence that outlined the terms of Ryan's settlement following the accident, a settlement that Claire's attorney had characterized as a windfall that Ryan was hoarding, but which read carefully was a structured payout, calibrated specifically to cover long-term medical costs and home modification expenses for a person with permanent mobility limitations. She pulled Claire's financial submissions next and laid them side by side. The account liquidations had occurred across a period of approximately 4 months, beginning roughly 6 weeks after Ryan's accident, while he was still hospitalized and continuing through his early outpatient recovery. The total moved was not a small amount. It had been presented as Claire securing her financial future during a period of instability, but the timing told a different story when you looked at it plainly. Ryan had been unable to work, unable to monitor accounts, unable to do much of anything except try to relearn the basic functions of daily life. And during that exact window, the shared accounts had been emptied. Then there were the emails. Evelyn had not allowed them into the verbal record, but she had the documents in front of her now, and she read them without the filter of courtroom procedure. Claire had written to at least 4 people in their shared social circle, one of whom Evelyn recognized as someone she herself had spoken to at a professional event the previous year, describing Ryan in terms that were clinical in their precision and devastating in their effect. Mood instability, irrational behavior, inability to distinguish between productive anger and paranoid fixation. The language was careful enough to sound concerned rather than malicious, but the cumulative portrait it built was of a man whose testimony and judgment could not be trusted. A man who had, as a result of his accident, become someone unreliable and potentially volatile. Evelyn sat with that for a long moment. She thought about how she had entered the courtroom that morning, what she had seen, what she had decided before anyone had said a single word. She thought about the look on Ryan's face when she had ordered him to stand, not defiance, not calculation, but the particular stillness of a person who had been asked to prove their own suffering to someone who had already decided they were lying. She thought about her mother's face, and she made a decision. When Evelyn returned to the bench, the room resettled quickly. She did not look at Claire or her attorney immediately. She addressed Douglas first and told him that the court required the financial records submitted by the respondent to be cross-referenced against the transaction history from the accounts listed in Claire's exhibits. She said she was also requesting an independent review of the communications submitted by the petitioner's counsel to determine whether the pattern of correspondence constituted deliberate misrepresentation to third parties with the intent of influencing the respondent's legal and social standing. Claire's attorney was on his feet before Evelyn finished the sentence. He said that request exceeded the scope of a property dispute, and that his client's private communications were not subject to court-ordered review absent a formal finding of fraud. Evelyn looked at him with an expression that did not invite further comment, and told him to sit down. She said the court had the authority to examine any evidence that bore materially on the credibility of the claims before it, and that she had determined this evidence did. She said if he wanted to challenge that determination, he was welcome to file the appropriate motion. She told him again to sit down. He sat. What followed was not fast. Nothing in a courtroom ever moved as quickly as the moments that mattered most. A court clerk was dispatched to contact the Financial Review Office. Documentation was formally cataloged. Douglas submitted a supplemental request for the Independent Communications Review, which Evelyn approved on the record. Claire's attorney objected twice more and was overruled both times. Claire herself had stopped looking composed. The carefully maintained neutrality of her expression had developed a tension around the eyes that she couldn't fully control, the kind that appears when a person realizes the ground they were standing on is shifting, and they're not sure how far they're going to fall. Ryan watched all of it from his position near the side wall. He had not moved his wheelchair closer to the respondent's table. He stayed where he was, slightly apart from the formal geography of the proceedings, and he watched Evelyn work through the record with the focused, unsentimental efficiency that had apparently always been there, just previously aimed in the wrong direction. Margaret was still in the gallery. She had declined the aide's offer to help her to a waiting area during the extended proceedings. She sat with her hands folded and watched the room the way someone watches a thing they have needed to see resolved for a very long time. The Financial Review took the better part of an hour. When the clerk returned with the cross-referenced summary, Evelyn read it without expression. Then she set it down, removed her reading glasses, and looked at the courtroom. She said that the record now showed a pattern of financial conduct by the petitioner that was inconsistent with the characterization presented to the court that morning. The account liquidations had occurred while the respondent was hospitalized and had not been disclosed in the petitioner's initial financial submission. The total amount moved represented the majority of the couple's shared liquid assets. The respondent's own financial records showed no corresponding transactions. He had not touched the accounts before or after the liquidations. She said further that the communications submitted by the petitioner's counsel, which had been framed as personal correspondence, reflecting genuine concern, showed a deliberate and sustained effort to damage the respondent's credibility and social standing during a period when he was physically incapacitated and unable to respond. The language used was not the language of worry. It was the language of strategy. Claire's attorney began to speak. Evelyn held up one hand without looking at him and kept going. She said she was ruling in favor of the respondent on the matter of the property. The house on Callaway Drive would remain with Ryan Holloway. The petitioner's claim was denied. She said further that the financial conduct documented in the record was being referred to the county's Independent Financial Review Board for formal examination, and that the communications pattern was being flagged for review by the bar's ethics office, given the apparent coordination between the petitioner and her counsel in presenting selectively edited materials to the court. The room was very quiet. Then Evelyn did something that was not required by any procedural rule, and that she had not planned when she walked back through the door behind the bench. She looked at Ryan directly, and she said, not as a legal formality, not as part of the ruling, but as a plain statement in front of everyone present, that she owed him an apology. She said that she had come into the proceedings that morning with assumptions she had not examined, and that she had treated him in a manner that was not consistent with the standard this court was supposed to uphold. She said she was sorry for that, and she meant it without qualification. Ryan looked at her. He didn't say anything right away. The room was waiting to see what he would do with it, whether he would accept it graciously or let the silence stretch into something pointed. He did neither. He just nodded once, slowly, not as a performance of forgiveness, as an acknowledgement that what she had said was real and that he had heard it. It was enough. Claire left the courtroom quickly, her attorney close behind her. She did not look at Ryan on her way out. She did not look at Margaret. She moved through the side exit with the clipped efficiency of someone who has calculated exactly how much dignity they can retrieve from a situation and is focused entirely on retrieving it. The door closed behind her without a sound. The gallery began to empty gradually. People collected their things and filed out, speaking in low voices. A few lingered near the back, the way people do when they're not quite ready to leave a room where something significant has happened. The courthouse aide returned to Margaret's side and offered an arm. She accepted it this time, rising slowly from her seat. Evelyn came down from the bench. It was an unusual thing for a judge to do before a room had fully cleared, and a few of the lingering observers noticed it. She walked to where her mother was standing and put a hand on her arm, not the formal gesture of a daughter who visits on holidays and calls when she remembers, but something quieter and more honest than that. Margaret covered her daughter's hand with her own and didn't say anything. Some things don't need to be said in rooms like that. Then Margaret looked toward Ryan, who was still near the side wall, and she moved toward him slowly, the aide steadying her on the left. She stood in front of his wheelchair and looked at him, the way she had looked at him when she walked through the doors that morning, with the clear, unguarded gratitude of someone who has never forgotten and never stopped being grateful. She told him that she had wanted to say something to him for years. She said she had written letters she never sent and had conversations in her head that went nowhere because she didn't know how to reach him without making it worse. She said she was glad she finally had the chance to say it out loud, that what he had done that night had not been nothing, that it had cost him everything, and that she knew it, and that she had never once treated it as anything less than what it was. Ryan looked up at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite an expression, more like the release of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, and had finally been allowed to surface. He said that he hadn't done it to be owed anything. He said he had never wanted her to carry it. She said she knew that. She said that was exactly why she had to say it. Evelyn stood a few feet back and watched them. She was not part of this moment, and she understood that. She was something more uncomfortable than that she was a witness to a grace she had almost prevented from ever reaching the room. The last of the gallery observers drifted out. The clerk gathered the remaining documents from the bench. The courtroom, which had held so much tension for so many hours, settled into the particular quiet of a space that has been used hard and is now empty. Ryan pushed his wheelchair toward the exit, slowly, the way he always moved, without urgency, without self-consciousness, just covering the distance in front of him. At the door, he turned back once, not to look at anyone in particular, just the reflex of a person leaving a room they won't come back to. Then he went through the doors and out into the corridor, where the late afternoon light was coming through the tall windows in long, flat angles, and the sound of the building was ordinary. Again, footsteps, a phone ringing somewhere, the distant mechanical thud of an elevator. He didn't stop in the corridor. He kept moving out through the main entrance, down the accessible ramp to the sidewalk, and into the open air. The afternoon was cool, and the street was ordinary, and the courthouse behind him looked exactly the same as it had when he arrived that morning. But something had shifted in the weight he was carrying, not gone, not fixed, just slightly different in the way a load shifts when you've been walking a long time and finally adjust your grip. He had not won anything he could hold in his hands. He had not gotten back the years or the money or the person he had once believed in. He had gotten the house which was real and mattered. He had gotten the truth told out loud in a room with witnesses which mattered in a different way. And he had gotten something he hadn't expected, and hadn't asked for the look on Margaret's face when she said what she said, and the knowledge that the thing he had done on that street on a cold November night had not disappeared into the dark the way he had always half believed it had. It had been held somewhere carefully by someone who remembered. That was not nothing. Several months later, Ryan took a part-time consulting position with a non-profit organization that worked on accessible design for public and residential spaces, reviewing building plans, advising on modifications, assessing whether the structures people lived and worked in were actually built for the full range of people who needed to use them. The work suited him. It required the same technical judgment he had always had, and it put it towards something that had a different kind of weight than anything he had done before the accident. He still lived in the house on Callaway Drive. He had repainted one of the interior walls a different color, a small change that he had been putting off for years, for no reason he could fully articulate, and that turned out to make the space feel noticeably different. He noticed it every morning. On a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, he was in the park 2 blocks from the house, going through a set of revised blueprints on his tablet, the kind of work he could do anywhere when he heard someone say his name. He looked up. Margaret was walking toward him, along the path, moving slowly with a wooden cane he hadn't seen her use before an aide, a half-step behind. She looked smaller in the open air than she had in the courtroom, but her eyes were exactly the same, clear and direct, and carrying the same settled quality they had carried that morning several months ago. She sat down on the bench beside the path and told him she came to this park sometimes when the weather was decent. She said she hadn't expected to see him. He said he hadn't expected to see her either. They sat for a few minutes in the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill the space between them with anything unnecessary. Then Margaret looked at him with that clear, unhurried expression and told him that she had been thinking about something she wanted to say. She said that there were people in the world who helped others because they were strong enough to. And then there were people who helped because they were simply the kind of person who sees something wrong and moves toward it without calculating the cost first. She said she thought he was the second kind. She said she thought that was rarer. Ryan looked at the path ahead of him for a moment. Then he looked back at her, and he smiled. Not the small, controlled expression he used in rooms where he needed to manage how much he gave away, but something fuller and less guarded than that. The kind of smile that takes up more of a person's face than they usually allow. The afternoon light came through the trees in the easy, unhurried way it does in early spring, when the season has just decided to stay. The park was ordinary. The city around it was ordinary. Nothing about the moment was large or dramatic or constructed to mean something. It meant something anyway.